Okay. All right. Thank you all for coming. We're here to talk about teaching, but not about how to be a better teacher, because there are lots of places on campus that do that. What I hope to talk about today, in the context of career planning, is where teaching fits in. So with every workshop, we immediately start talking about criteria. And there are specific criteria for excellent, sometimes for very good, and sometimes for satisfactory, depending on your unit and your school and the campus. So please do take a look, and the bar you're trying to meet will be different depending on whether you're a balanced case, whether you're looking at excellence in teaching, or whether you're looking at excellence in research or service, and you just need to meet satisfactory. So that's probably starting to sound like a broken record if you've been to several of these. But again, we're trying to take teaching and put it into that framework, and also with a mind to building that into your time and rank. So all of the handouts that I've given you are actually handouts that we tend to pass out to people who are looking to prepare a dossier. So it's really soon to think about how will you put together materials to show what you've accomplished in teaching. And that's really how those were designed. They're questions to think about when you're writing a statement. They're types of evidence that you might put into a dossier. But my thinking was that if you have those materials today and you're several years out, you have a great opportunity to think about what it is you hope to do and where it fits into that context, and how you can document those things as you go along, so you're not racing backwards trying to find those sorts of things retrospectively. So in terms of talking about criteria and career planning, one thing that you'll find in most of the criteria is the expectation that in some way that is discipline and unit appropriate, your teaching will take on more life than it did pre-tenure. And that's normal. It's going to vary a little bit. Some of you may have units that only have undergraduates, or may have units that only have graduates, or some balance of the two. So there aren't normally, at the campus level, clear expectations. You should have 7 doctoral students and 3 postdocs by the time you're up for full. That just doesn't fit for certain disciplines. And yet for others, that's exactly what they're looking to see. The idea is that your footprint gets a little bit bigger. So the expectation is that you're doing good things in the classroom before tenure. And now you want to think about, how is your influence extending beyond the classroom? Sometimes that's really simple. It's living on in the bodies of students and their accomplishments, right? And so in the music school, it may mean that your students are getting chosen for parts for places in orchestras, for roles in performances. They may be getting placed professionally if you're in the business school. They may be winning awards. If you're in an article-driven field, they may be co-authoring publications with you. So there are lots of different ways to look at student success, but that's one way to think about a footprint that extends outside the classroom. Another thing that might happen is, as you look to demonstrate leadership, some of the materials you've developed are effective and people are starting to notice. So you might find that colleagues at other universities are saying, how do you teach this class? Can you share your materials with me? And then you can use actually their syllabi and what they take from your work as evidence of your impact beyond your classroom. I believe in the School of Education, and I'm not sure I've seen it anywhere else, that publications are mentioned as required. The campus criteria gets misread quite a lot to say you must have a publication for excellence in teaching. It's actually a list of things that are all desirable. And so it sort of depends on the unit you're coming from. But if you're thinking about excellence in teaching, you may also be looking ahead to publications that are related to the scholarship of teaching and learning. And there are, if you're interested, offices and funds available to support that. So those are sort of the traditional avenues. However, you're also at a point where you want to start to think about how this makes sense for what you actually want to do. So you have the freedom of tenure, you can expand it any way you want. What makes sense for you? What's interesting? I have a colleague who's started 2 different study abroad programs, and in the timeline that I invented, I put a creation of a study abroad program. That's something that's not been into any criteria anywhere, but it sure is a great way to show that you're taking students beyond your classroom and having an impact in other communities. There are service learning activities that really engaging, if it connects your research to a community and you bring students along for that. You got handouts, right? Yes, okay, perfect. We had a plan for making sure we caught everyone, but I wouldn't want you to sit there without them. So it may be that there are other types of activities. For me, I know that what made the associate rank a little bit more coherent than pre-tenure was I realized the connection between my research and teaching in the form of graduate student mentor. And then everything was easier to work on simultaneously because we were all working on the same projects and the students were benefiting and the impact was easy to show that way, but it also was making my research much more exciting for me, and I found a teaching role inside that. So it is a chance to make personal decisions and to figure out exactly where your goals for research, and we talked about service goals. Now what do you want to accomplish for teaching? If you are thinking recently tenured moving forward, if you're looking for satisfactory in teaching, you don't want 7 teaching goals, but maybe 2 or 3 ways that you hope to continue in the same vein and show impact, or to branch out in certain ways. That's a really healthy way to think about it. The flip side is that if you don't change anything and you just keep being really good in the classroom, you might get bored. So it's nice to think about what would make this interesting or exciting for me without letting it derail your plans in the other areas, particularly if satisfactory is the bar you're looking for. So with all of that context in mind, in terms of career planning and thinking about reasonable goals, but a few ways to show an impact beyond your classroom, what I want to do is use this handout as our guide. Oh, and I just wanted to mention this. You've seen this now in a lot of different formats. It's exactly the same as the one you've received if you've come to others. So all we're doing is taking your e-dossier. We're talking about how to fill the teaching folders. And on this, you have 2 e-dossier handouts. One is the whole e-dossier without the folders expanded, and then the blue one has the names of the folders, but they're open, and there's some ideas for what you might put into each of those. So if you have questions or ideas and you'd like to talk more about how to fill those folders, how to document those things, that's what the blue handout is there. And hopefully we're sort of just filling in pieces of the puzzle as we move forward. So returning then to this piece of paper whose color shall remain unnamed. I know. Peach. I don't, yeah, maybe. Peachy brown. It looks like stucco, but stucco's not a color, it's a material. But to me that looks like,
I'm sure it's a nail polish color somewhere though.
Oh.
I mean, use it.
LPI would call it something, wouldn't they? That's exactly what we need to check. So what we've tried to do is look at documenting teaching in a variety of ways. And I think that the language, yeah, it's on this other side. The language for many of the criteria have things like showing excellence, leadership, engagement, and innovation. So those are sort of the concepts that we're trying to hit. But then when you take that and you translate it into something practical, and you start to think about, well, okay, what goes in the dossier? How do I show I've accomplished these things? Then you might think about types of evidence. And so the triangle shows 3 different kinds of evidence, 3 different sources of evidence. The first is yourself. So what do you say about your teaching? What kinds of things do you think of when you think of you on your best day teaching? And there are no right answers there. So it's perfectly fine to be creative, to have things that you value in the classroom. And then the creative work is figuring out, okay, if I value independence, or if I value knowledge on X scale, how do I document that? And if you think about it 5 years out, it's really easy to think about different ways that you might show that. But when we're looking at this sort of thing, it's materials you've created, it's your voice of who you are as a teacher. There's also a handout about teaching statements. It's very soon to be writing your teaching statement, but not too soon to think about those kinds of questions. So you can see, some of them you'll read and you'll think, not me. And that's great, that's also very educational. So you want to find where you fit in terms of identity in the classroom. The other source of information, and I'm going to hit on a few sort of policy issues as I go through these. And one thing I didn't say about the self and the teaching philosophy is that this statement goes in your dossier and it should stay the same throughout. Some people send the teaching statement out to external readers, even in cases of excellence for research. Some people don't, and that's fine, but it's not too soon the year before you go up to really start thinking about that and have a draft and spend some time with it. So then moving to students as a source of evidence. One thing that's required in the dossier is student evaluations. There are lots of problems with student evaluations, and we know that. Your job is to make sure that is not the only type of evidence you provide. It's one form of evidence. If that's all you do in the dossier, that's all we've got. And that's not the intention at all. So what you can think about is what other things from students can you show? And I think one of the most important things, and this is so much easier to think about as a planning activity as opposed to retrospective, is to think about student learning and how you can show it in your classroom. It's much more satisfying to do that than to sort of find something superficial after the fact. I wanted them to do well and 80% got an A on the final exam. That's nice, but wouldn't it be so much nicer to show that they had learned something by measuring it beforehand and afterwards, or by demonstrating what they were able to do at the end of a course with you, or a year, or whatever the metric is. So if you start to think about those kinds of things and how you might show some progress, just show that being with you made a difference. That's a nice thing to build in, and it's a great way to provide additional evidence. Sometimes they complain because the readings are really hard, but what's really compelling is how much more they can do with the material at the end of the semester. So sometimes hard things are really valuable, and you can think about how to demonstrate that with other evidence from your students. And then finally, there are other types of evidence, and here's another policy piece. Technically, it says that every associate professor should get an annual review every year. We also know full well that that takes different forms, sometimes the form of not much happening at all. There should be an annual review, and you should initiate a conversation if one is not already in play. And it can be as formal or informal as you like, if your department doesn't already have a policy, but you should check in. And that's a conversation with your chair, unless it's dictated otherwise. But you might also have a senior person in an allied area. So you should be, bless you, proactive about getting feedback, because 4 years to plan, if someone in your department feels like no one can be promoted without X, it's probably really easy to do that with 4 years notice, and impossible to fix it if you haven't gotten any feedback, and then there you are. So these conversations are really important. They should be formative, and they should be sort of goal-setting conversations. Some units have them already and some don't. And at a minimum, if you have a salary review or something, and you can fold that into a conversation, that might be a nice way to make sure that something that's sort of a two-way conversation starts happening if you're in a unit where that's not already the norm. The other thing that should happen, and is expected in your dossier, but we're finding is really implemented in quite different ways across campus, is peer observations of your teaching. Some units say the chair appoints the person, they pop in and they surprise you, you don't know, and then that goes directly to the chair. That's sort of an extreme version of peer review. There are some units that don't mention it at all, and then you go to present your dossier for promotion and they say, where are your peer evaluations? And you haven't known to invite anyone. So this is the important message here. If there's nothing formal in place, start having someone come. Eliza gives a really strong version of this. Every course, every course that you've taught at least once, and once a semester. In my unit, that would be an awful lot because of the size of the department. You just simply couldn't do that to people. But once a year is a really healthy number given the size of my home department. So these things may be sort of cultural, they may have to do with what you're able to ask. It's also perfectly appropriate that peer not be defined as only full professors. If that's the norm in your department, if there are directors of graduate studies, undergraduate studies who are of the same rank but hold a title that makes them experts on the content or the curriculum, that can be really valuable. If you're teaching an online course, you could share it with just about anyone, including people who are on other campuses, and they could do a review of your curriculum. So there aren't right and wrong ways to do this. You can make it fit the context, but somebody should see you teach in some way regularly. Martha?
Can I add a comment to that? Because having on the other end of reviewing some of these peer evaluations, some of them are useful and some are absolutely useless. And so I think you may have to educate your evaluators on how to provide something that's useful. And so for me, it's not just that they come watch your class and they say, it was good, or maybe the print should be a little bit bigger here and you're not talking quite loudly enough when you're facing the board. And those are all nice things to know, but you want to have a conversation with, here's the challenge of this particular class, here's what I'm trying to fix. And pick a date that would be good for them to come in. And I actually think it's worth, someone asked me to give a peer evaluation of her course from outside the department, and it happened to be a day that the students just weren't prepared. And so, it was obviously frustrating for her, and she dragged them out, but I just said, look, here are some ways to add some structure so they're more likely to be prepared. Why not come watch it again in 3 months? So, help them take a really active role in helping them give as strong of a letter as they can. It should be about more than just, I watched this class.
Right, and you can set that up. Like everything else, if you invite someone and then give them a syllabus and then tell them what the focus is and say, this day would be great because I'm trying, what you've done is direct their attention and it will come back in the content. And it's much more useful than I went and all the students showed up on time, and well, those are good things too, but it's not quite the same in terms of carrying that weight. Even if your department has a set structure so that the chair assigns someone every year, there's no rule against getting additional views, and that can be really helpful. So if you do ask someone outside your department or someone else in your department to come take a look, particularly if you'd like their feedback on some aspect, and they write a letter for you or some sort of report, ask them to share that with your chair as well, if you wish, because then that can be added to your dossier. And if the chair wishes to distinguish between solicited and candidate solicited evaluations, that's fine. It's still meaningful information, I think.
I've seen at some institutions, they have a formalized template, rubric. Are there any departments across campus that have some kind of rubric that would be helpful? Or?
Well, yes, so those are two different questions. One is, do they have rubrics, and the other is it helpful? And I might take those separately. We have a rubric that you fill out how the time was spent. It's great in an intro language class, and it doesn't really tell you much about the other content courses. But SEAL will actually work with you to help set standards. And I imagine that anything that you put in place about your class and then provided to an observer would be useful for them to have. There are templates around campus. I don't know if you're going to weigh in a different way.
Well, I've seen some that I just thought were useless. They really tried to get you to do that. I just came to class today. They look at the syllabus and stuff, but it wasn't very helpful about, just one snapshot doesn't tell me that much about someone's teaching. I guess is the bottom line. There have to be longer conversations. I don't know if you've seen this rubric from Kansas about 7 ways of evaluating teaching. And
oh yeah, it used to be linked to an IU page, and it's not anymore. They had a big grant to make it all.
Yeah, this is all AAU. And so anyway, I've got a copy of that. I can send it around.
Oh great,
yeah.
And it's,
okay.
Please also
Mosaic, I don't know how, they're not related to CETL anymore, but there's the active learning, it's a UITS, I guess, thing.
Yeah.
So those people are also willing, like CETL, to come into your classroom and evaluate how you're using specifically active learning techniques, and they have a rubric as well.
Great. Yeah, so there are some, and to the degree that they're not applicable, you can take it as a starting point and then make it work. Did you have a question?
No,
No,
I'm just
okay.
looking it up.
Oh, okay, perfect. So those are the 3 different sources of information, and I think at this point, from a planning perspective, the most important.
that maybe. No, I don't think so. I think it's more recent than that. I'll send it to Kim, and you'll put it on the website for
Sure,
us.
yeah, happy to. The most important upshot is it's really hard to do this after the fact, right? So if you can think about the kinds of things you'd like to show and start experimenting with collecting evidence, the worst case is you have too much. This is true also for student letters. After 5 years in rank, you probably have several hundred. But if you drag and drop them to a student letter folder in your inbox, it takes no extra work on your part. And then you just sort of sort through and maybe find a representative sample, but they're all right where you need them. We used to give a workshop to talk about a shoebox, and that shoebox is probably not under your bed anymore. It's probably in a cloud, but it's the same concept, and it's much easier to dump too much in there than it is to try and find it later on. So those are the types of evidence. And then the only other thing that I wanted to explain was this graphic on the other side of this handout. A lot of times when you're talking about a teaching narrative, either for tenure or for promotion, there seems to be sort of this expectation that you have a rags to riches story. I tried it, it was terrible, they hated it, I fixed it, and now it's all good. And that's great if that's the case, but you don't need to start at the bottom of your cohort in order to show improvement, and you don't need to end up with 100% happy students to show that you've thought about teaching and you've made revisions. So what I hope to show, and we've had some fun conversations about this, I think the arrows could point in both directions on all of these. It really should be a little bit more fluid, but 2 dimensions has a somewhat limited, and then the arrows could be going in both directions. But the idea is that you make a plan, you try it, you think about how it went, you look at how the student's performance gives you evidence of the success, how their reaction to it gives you evidence of the success, and how your comfort with the implementation gives you information about its success, and then you revisit it and you show some level of engagement, of thinking about how it went, of modifying different parts of it so that the final product is more effective. And if you can keep effectiveness in mind as opposed to happiness, I think that guides the thinking behind this process and makes it a little bit less personal, a little bit more intellectual. It's you're engaging in your plan, you're testing a plan as if it were any kind of other experimentation. There's no content area that's really easy, and there's no undergraduate who came to IU knowing it all already. So some of the obstacles are common, and to the extent that there's a common objective, which is taking a student who hasn't seen X before and making X familiar and turning it into a tool they can use as they move forward, those are nice themes to include in this conversation about being engaged. But there may be things that are just absolutely discipline specific that you have to also think about. How am I going to show how important this construct is, how essential it is to student success in this area, and those kinds of things. So you can also think about how to translate your engagement. And sometimes it's a one and done. I wanted to do this project, I tried it, and each time I do it, I make a little tweak and it gets better. Well, that's a long-term one. Sometimes it's this project wasn't working, I threw it out, I replaced it with this one, the whole class feels better. And those are all fine. So, and you may have multiple points of engagement, or it may be part of a narrative where it's all connected. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But again, I think if underneath it all, it's about staying interested in teaching and making sure you're as effective as possible, and you can show that through artifacts and through your narrative, you will have succeeded in demonstrating engaged teaching and innovation as well, and that can be quite discipline specific or really quite general. I hit you with a lot of handouts, and I've taken a handout that wasn't intended for planning and hopefully turned it around to a planning document because I think it's a little easier to approach it that way. And then I just want to open this to questions, because I imagine some of you might be saying, okay, I am spending 60% of my time teaching, how do I do less? And others are trying to explore how they might expand in different directions. You might have all sorts of questions about resources. So I will stop talking and leave you with these handouts that probably give you lots of things to think about as you chart your path and I'm happy to take questions. I assume Debbie and Martha will be as well. Happy to answer questions about the timeline as well for those of you who are in the cohort if you're curious about how to fit that in. One thing I wouldn't underestimate is the resources available for teaching. There's money for service learning, and there's money for active learning and for bringing technology into the classroom. So if you have a great idea and it feels overwhelming, it might be because you haven't identified the right resource that can make it feasible. So there may be some conversation there as well.
Yeah, IDA. I mean, I was approached by Kalani Craig just because of the writing groups and was invited to, talk about a new course on using technology. And when I came to the meeting, there were like 6 people just there to talk to me about my class. So
Wonderful.
I felt underprepared, but yeah. So keep in mind that I mentioned Mosaic. That's a thing. Check that out. And then, but IDA also, they're actively seeking meetings. With professors who just want some ideas and.
I had a similar,
Did you have a similar
experience.
encounter?
Well, it was, out of UITS, they were hoping to make courses online. And so essentially they were looking for good spots where that could be accomplished. And I went, and there were a lot more people than I anticipated also.
I was just wondering if there's an expectation in terms of your teaching philosophy in that statement that it changes from when you went up from your tenure to promotion. I mean, I don't know if they're checking that, but I could also envision that if you have a certain approach or the way you think about teaching, that might be something that remains stable. Or
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's important to know that the dossier is frozen all by itself. There's no comparison. So the assumption is, maybe from the CV, someone might get a sense of change in the number of graduate students, but if it's not on your CV and you didn't put it in your narrative, it's not on the table for evaluation. So if you don't, and this I think is sometimes field specific because some graduate students teach a ton and some don't teach much at all. So your teaching philosophy starts to develop at different points in your career. So my teaching got easier when I got a tenure track job. And I already was pretty comfortable with who I was and how I wanted to interact. And so I didn't feel like it was this malleable thing, and that's perfectly normal, depending on the discipline. Other people have postdocs and they're researchers, and they come in and then suddenly they have 200 eyes staring at them, and then, then you start sort of figuring out how to make that work in a different point.
Thank you.
Is there any sort of evaluation on your breadth of teaching? Because I have low teaching loads because I buy out a lot of my classes, and so then the exchange for that is I have to teach a high volume required course, right? So I have 300 students for one class, and I teach that class. And so I don't have a lot of, and I don't know if this will change in the next couple of years or not. It's easier for me that way, sort of, but I also manage graduate students, TAs, and things like that. So, but I'm teaching the same courses. I've yet, since I've been here, to teach a course in my specialty, which is sort of its own, I'm teaching statistics. Luckily, you don't have to update the literature, that's a good thing, but there's also, I haven't taught a course in policing since I've been here. So I'm sort of, I don't call it a rut, and I'm getting, I feel like I'm getting better at teaching statistics after all these times, but is there some sort of, judgment of that? This is just is what it is for me. I couldn't take on any more teaching, but I also have more graduate students probably than I did as an untenured professor than anybody in the department. So I have other ways to demonstrate, but I'm teaching the same 2 courses.
I think, so I think that there's a clear understanding of these sorts of things at the campus level. I think it's worth your while in your narrative to talk about what's normal in your discipline. Because
I don't know if this is normal either, though. In my department,
normal for your career, or normal for your arrangement, or normal for why you were hired. And sometimes it's a very it's an individual specific normal, and sometimes it's a unit specific normal. But if, for example, you are supposed to teach one giant course per year in X department, and you say that, and then the compensation for that is these are things that are helpful for people to know. But in truth, teaching differs so much across campus that by the time it gets to the campus level, is really apparent. The other thing I think that we know, I think anybody at any level should know, is that you don't control what you're assigned to teach. That's about a unit and a chair assigning you and where you fit into that department. And those things are not under people's control. So what you might actually benefit from in this case, as you talk about the graduate supervision, that's your expansion, right? That's your additional, because if the graduate students weren't working with you, you wouldn't have that other dimension, but you do. And so I think already it doesn't sound like unidimensional teaching to me. It sounds like one giant service course and lots of mentoring. And that's a pretty normal load. You could mention the buyouts, particularly if they're grant buyouts, and yeah, I think that's great to mention, but it's because it's good, not because it's an apology.
Okay.
That's right. You're telling a story the same way you would about your research career. Here's where I was when I came out for tenure. I've had this great opportunity because of the success of my research programs, you know, and so you know, to be sure that I'm meeting the departmental needs, I've agreed to teach this class, right? Just shape your story.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm not sure if this is how much this will resonate with people in other schools, but I have noticed from being on these committees in my school that awards seem to matter a lot in the teaching category. And in our school, the teaching awards that are there are require submission of what's essentially a teaching dossier. So I mean literally about 3 or 4 dozen categories. So you could submit like 50 to 100 pieces of evidence. My understanding is that's not true in all schools.
Yeah.
I can say that's the case.
Yeah.
Is this the School of Education?
No, this is the.
What you're saying is really important for 2 reasons. One, because awards can be very meaningful. And at the campus level, you notice how meaningful they are because your colleagues will mention this person's won X award, and there are usually trustees teaching and mentoring awards. However, those are under scrutiny right now precisely because the requirements for signing them vary so much from one unit to another. So there's a conversation going on about process and procedure. I was horrified to realize that I worked really hard for the TTA award, and in some departments they just give it to the person who's about to go up for tenure because it looks good. And those things all exist, and they all
happened in my department, but
Well, those are totally discounted by the committees because of that.
And I was scandalized and I had to sort of argue, no, this is important. But this is something that I think has come to the forefront and will be discussed in terms of having an actual process and making that carry weight again. In the meantime, however, I think there's really important advice in what you say, which is, instead of just saying, I won the X award, tell what the selection process was based on. Because if you say, I was a recipient, one of 3 that year in my whole school, of this award, and it was based on a dossier in which I included 100 pieces of evidence, then people will see it for what it is. And I think that's important. Now, if you just got it because you got lucky and it was your turn, you don't have to say anything about the process. But to the extent that you worked hard to get that, you should make sure it's known.
Well, and I'm really glad to hear that it's being reviewed, because I think my concern / question was along the lines of, because I've seen it mattering in our school, you know, there's part of me that wants to suggest that some people look into these awards, but the reality is that they're competitive. I mean, people apply for them in our school, but they're so burdensome, and so also there's some inequities, right? I mean, the people who apply for them tend not to be people with like babies and small kids at home. You know, often are not like the single parents with full custody, often are not people of color. Like it just seems to be, you know, part of the system that's really challenging, because it's,
and
who has time to do another dossier?
It's also school specific. It sounds to me like your school might have a very burdensome dossier. Ours is a selection process based on salary merit. The people with the top 5 scores are invited to submit more materials. It's a hybrid of You have to put some extra stuff in, but you have to be selected by the salary committee as one of the top 5 on a totally different kind of thing. And I'm not saying that's the right way to do it, but the point is they're so different from one unit to another.
Right.
that
Yeah, I've heard
it's-
other ones are just like sort of like do a 3-page letter in your syllabi and like you're good to go.
Yeah,
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yours
and
is
so
nothing.
yeah,
Yours
so
is
I
just
guess
small
we'll leave it
package
at
that
that then.
rotates
But
around.
right.
I haven't rotated into it yet though.
so I guess then the other thing would be, do you have a sense then for other things that you would see at the campus or school levels as being so compelling? Because aside from that, I mean, I would say that the other things I see for people who are either doing balance cases, so teaching becomes really important, would be that I've seen committees care a lot about publications, right? That publications and awards seem to be things like
Right.
student letters don't, at least in the committees I've been on, don't seem to carry weight, and
Student letters
evaluations
become
moderately.
really important if student evaluations are below what's expected for that size class or that unit. But I would say, and awards can be very important. It's important to describe them. The awards that I think are worth, something you said made me think of this. When you encourage people to go for an award, there are awards that just recognize you, but there are also awards that give you the tools to do something. And those are less burdensome to apply for and more specifically targeted. So active learning grants, things through CEDL and SODL and related to technology or service learning. If you have a particular goal and you can secure funding to meet that goal, that is probably both a better investment and also looks equally good. It means you had an idea and someone gave you some funding to get it done, and then you win twice, right? Because you get the recognition and you get the financial support to help you meet that goal. So I would say if you're making a judgment about time and where to put your energy, I would go for something that actually supports achieving a particular goal, precisely because I think all of the inherent labor is probably more equitable and your chance of getting it is good, and also if you do get it, it'll help you meet the goal you had already set, and so it fits right into the plan.
That's great advice. Thank you.
But yeah, I really think it depends also on whether you're trying to be excellent, very good, or satisfactory, effective in teaching. And then what you need to do to demonstrate that is going to go along with the bar you're trying to meet. So publications for anything but excellent are probably a little out of the norm. If you're shooting for very good and you want to be a balanced case and you have teaching publications, that's probably a nice way to sort of check it off and not worry about it, because everyone recognizes that at the unit level or the school level. But some of that's about having a conversation for the internal bar you're trying to meet. Martha?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really important, I mean, the way I always think of it is if you're going for very good or excellent, excellent, I think you do have to have publications. If you're going for very good in teaching, I think you have to be able to show that your teaching has had an impact beyond your own classroom.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of ways of doing that. It could be that you guys have had a course that wasn't very successful and you took on overhauling it, and not only were you successful, but then the people who have come on, people are doing better in the next class or whatever it is. Curriculum development, I think, is something to really pay attention to, because that's what folks want to understand. And the other thing is, if you're doing active learning and you make your materials available, right, that's a pretty simple way of doing things. And one thing I'd like to do in our department is to, get a Canvas site or something with active learning materials, because once you come up with them once, you need to come up with them twice, right? And I'd like to see that if I use a junior faculty member's materials, I have to write my name there or something, and you have a list of these materials that are used by 10 people, or maybe your own list. But I think things like that are other ways of doing that. If a publication is not what's going to help you to do what you want to do most effectively in teaching, then you just have to find another way to make the case. Do it well and then figure out how to best show you've done it well.
Yeah, or do it well and then figure out who's noticed.
Yeah.
And chances are someone has, and probably lots of someones, and then you just have to identify it and document it. Yeah, I mean, I think teaching publications are not easy. They're not any easier than research ones, so it could be a real distraction if that's not actually part of your goal. Other questions? Planning or retrospect or criteria or?
Another way to get outside recognition is working if you have teaching faculty in your department who probably are going to all the right meetings. when they work on a project together, they'll go to the paper about it, your name's on it, it's shown that what you've been working on has been disseminated, and that's actually what I had for a balance case.
That's a great suggestion.
Can we repeat that? I know.
So I think all of our departments have teaching faculty who, they spend their creative time thinking about how to teach well, right?
Okay.
They go to the education meetings, whereas we're going to our subject,
Got it,
discipline-specific
okay.
meetings. And so that's a good way to get, you're working with someone who's an expert, and then they can disseminate the stuff. It helps their career more than it helps you, right? So they'll be motivated to disseminate it, but your name's on it if you've done the project together.
So
I mean, I'm not
collaboration.
advocating using the teaching faculty, I'm advocating a partnership, but let them do
Co-authoring on
that.
a
Right,
project.
right,
Yeah.
okay.
Can I ask about the annual reviews
Sure.
that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
I thought I heard you say they are technically required. Is that right?
Yeah,
So I don't know. I'm just newly ignorant, just on the other side of this.
perfect.
Going through personnel reviews myself
Uh-huh.
now, but I don't get any sense that we do those.
Sometimes they give you a year to recover, and some policies at the unit level will say you don't get one until you've been in rank 7 years, but Canvas policy says everybody should have one. So that can take a much less formal feel once it gets past tenure. And I think, there's sort of two tensions here. One is getting you through tenure because it's up or out, you're under time pressure. And then when that goes away, it's more reasonable to think that you might need a softer touch. You might want the freedom to sort of redirect your line of research. And then when people start to be in rank for a longer period of time, there are some policies at the unit level that kick in and say, if you've been in rank for 7 years, that's the time when we start meeting annually to help you get all the way there, to get ready for promotion. My own unit reviewed that and thought, well, that doesn't make any sense because we're going to have such a nicer conversation if we're planning instead of making people feel like they're being paraded down for moving too slowly. And so now I believe it says there's an annual conversation and it's upon request, or you can get a fuller review. But the point would be to find someone senior in your department, if there isn't already an established mechanism, to get some feedback on interpretation of the criteria, the types of things they expect to see in a dossier, the types of cases. You might get examples and get some personalized feedback on how to move forward. There are lots of departments where the full professors will meet and they'll take a look at everyone's CV and provide feedback, but that just doesn't happen in the same form and not as formally as, of course, as VPFA would like to see it happen. But there is a policy. If you need to walk in and say, this policy says I get an annual
Yeah.
review, I can hand you the page and yeah, you're welcome to use it.
Yeah, so something written, not just.
Yeah. In fact, it's if we have it's handout from the first workshop.
No, I think he's talking about from the.
Yeah, the annual
reviewer.
review is a written.
Oh.
Like they have to give you a written review, or is it a?
That is
IBJC
not
for-
mandated, but that would be ideal.
And you're talking about that not just in regard to teaching.
Not at all, no,
That's all.
in general, some feedback. No, if you're looking at probably, for people who are looking for excellence in research, that conversation probably focuses primarily on the area of excellence
Right.
all the way through. Now, if you're looking at a balanced case, you want to be talking about all three areas all along. So yeah, the focus of that conversation, it's ideal if it comes back in writing, but I think the most important thing is to get some good feedback, something useful. And sometimes a nice thing to do is to do some of the legwork yourself. So if you want to know what it looks like to be a full professor in your field, think of the best 10 people you can and go look at their CV and look at what they had the year they were promoted. And then you can sort of start to get a sense of what that looks like. Because one thing I think when we're thinking about how to please departments and schools and campus, the most important thing is that the experts in your field say, you've done great work and we recognize this name and these are the right venues. So some of the research, depending on how different your department is, how many different disciplines are represented, some of that you might get more out of an annual review conversation if you go in armed saying, these are the people I'd like to, these are my potential leaders someday, these are the people who are respected in my field, and this is what their profile looks like. Again, it depends on your department. In my department, we have to do a little bit of that, just because there are different disciplines represented.
I think it also is important to know, yes, you'll focus mostly on your area of excellence, but I think it's important to know what effective or satisfactory looks like. And, and I think the hardest area to figure that out in as an associate professor is service. Because there's some expectation there'll be more than when you were an assistant professor, but it's hard to know what that is. And I think it's important. I mean, it tends to be the kind of thing that if the department likes you, they ignore. If they don't like you, they make a big deal of. I don't mean to say that people are being dishonest. I just think that's human nature. So it can be useful to just make sure you know what the standards are supposed to be.
And another thing, because I'm not sure people are good at articulating the standards, is that by asking the question, if there's an issue, you've given the chair the chance to say so.
Yeah.
And some chairs are not good at being uncomfortable. That's a really hard thing to say to someone, look, you're not pulling your weight here.
Yeah.
But if you ask the question and they say, you know what, I really would have preferred it if you had stepped up in the following ways, I would much rather know 4 years out than when I'm up for promotion. And so I think even if you ask it and you don't get the answer that's really clear about what the criteria is, having opened the conversation is really valuable.
For the grade distribution, I just had never seen that before. So, was that part of my tenure this year?
Yeah. And there wasn't that link, and now there is, which is awesome.
It shifted. Yeah, there used to be a different, so, we're victims of lots of changing interfaces. So it used to be the case that you could pull up an instructor and see every course they had taught and the grade distribution, and then that was no longer available. And for a couple of years, you had to kind of find it in different places. And now they've created a link so that it's all in one place again, but it's a different place in a slightly different format. But I think the idea is to prove that if you have 5.0 satisfaction with your instructor rating, that you also don't have a 4.0 GPA in everything you've taught.
Right, grade inflation.
It's super discipline specific, it's course specific, so I'm not sure. I suppose if there's a perception of an issue, you can address it in your narrative, but in now 2 full rounds of the campus tenure committee and 2 full years on the college tenure committee, I think grade distributions come up once, maybe twice. And it's always come up in the context of really giant lecture courses and low evaluations.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's statistics.
To help
It's
statistics.
Yeah,
There's
it's
no
never,
doubt,
I've
yeah.
never, maybe you disagree. I don't think anyone's ever been indicted. I think grades, provided you don't give everyone an A+, and then there might be something to see, but I don't think that that's something where there's a right answer. It's always contextualizing the class that people are teaching and the discipline and.
I'd like to see it when I'm looking at those statements, though, because it gives me an idea of, you're basically saying I'm requiring a lot of these students.
Yeah.
And, and I actually, my grade distribution is a little bit lower than my colleagues are, and the students are still satisfied with the class.
Yeah.
That means that you've gotten their trust in some way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it has to be lower than everybody else, but, at least not higher. Yes, my evaluators are much better, but it's not because I'm making it easy.
Yeah, I made the exact same argument in my tenure, I think.
I didn't make that argument, but I saw other people do it and thought it was a good idea.
Good.
I didn't say, but the fine print on those italicized suggestions, it started as the exactly what you'd find on our website for eDossier, and then Jamie and I expanded it to add other ideas. So, in some cases, it didn't feel very flexible across disciplines, so we added some more stuff.
I just know with a grade distribution for last stage, I was spending a lot of time trying to piece together like 5 different rosters to come up with it. And then I discovered it, and so I was like, why wasn't this link available? So it's so good that you have that there.
If
I had
you
no idea.
Google
I
it,
just
it now
Excel.
comes up because I forget every single time and then have to search how do you find the.
But when I found that, I was like, oh, I saved hours of time.
Now, are all of you only electronic evals, or are you still dancing between paper and electronic?
The whole
Okay.
campus is now.
Oh, yeah, I know
But I
currently.
think
People are still
but-
dancing.
The dossiers for many promotion dossiers still are half paper and half electronic reports.
For promotion,
And
though, because the
some-
time period long,
exactly,
yeah, I think all of our
exactly.
tenures were all
Exactly,
on
yeah, so
online.
this is nice, because that means moving forward, we're gonna,
Yeah.
there's some language in there.
Scan everything, even though like,
There's some language in there that specifically says, don't scan all of the comments, and so we need to say explicitly, if you only have electronic evaluations, save them as a PDF or put it in. It's the old paper ones that they wanted you to have
Our
someone.
secretary spent months.
Yes,
I
typing-
spent months.
Oh, no,
We did
they made our
help to
secretaries
do that.
Yeah,
typing up every single, yeah.
It wasn't the typing up, it was the, like, that you, like, when that direction, and this is my fault for, I should just ask somebody, but I thought I had to go through, so I had to create where the comments were gone. I think it was through literally making a PDF that I cropped and then
Yeah.
cut and then
Yeah.
pasted,
Yeah,
like,
no, they typed everything. So we got a
Oh.
document that had them all typed up.
right, we needed to, for the paper ones.
Yeah,
Yeah. For the electronic ones, it's nice, you just save it and stick it in there, and then give a little thought to your read me first page. Because I'm still seeing a lot of dossiers that are,
Where's the review first page?
in the teaching evaluation folder. Because otherwise you are expecting, and I do, your reader to open every single one of those and capture exactly what you'd like for them to see. And that's where it gets a little risky. It's not that people won't open them, but they're gonna open them and they're gonna scan and they may see different things. So to the extent that you can summarize that
In
in
the student course
some way.
evaluation?
Yeah, before you upload all of those PDFs, put a document that says read me first at the top that summarizes, and it can be really what you'd like. Maybe it's your course and your instructor rating, but maybe it's, these are the 3 characteristics that my students consistently rate me very well on, and here's what they've given me across these courses. Or sometimes what you're doing is breaking out graduates to undergraduates, breaking them up by class size, whatever is meaningful, there's no right answer, but what you show people in that first cover page is what they will see when they're scanning. Whereas if you don't tell them what to see, they might see all different sorts of things. They might pick up on one student comment, which isn't representative because it hasn't been highlighted in that way or summarized.
yeah, if there's a case where teaching effectiveness is under question, then at least some of the people on the committee will actually go and read all the comments, right? And so, but they don't, but they basically, I think, really only do that if there's a serious question of teaching effectiveness. If there isn't, people tend to trust the department to judge that appropriately.
When you open it, you scan. When you open and you scroll, you see a different portion of each document. You know, you just, it's makes good sense to tell your reader what they're looking at. Question?
this is minor level, but I just remember having this for the last stage and just being like, well, what is the quantity? You know, it was just so vague, and like, gosh, I better have plenty in there. And I know not every folder needs to be filled, but it's just hard to gauge how much is enough and when you're going overboard and spending time on things that you shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, yeah. So this is not the official word, but if you have an activity that you've continued to do in ranking, you've already taken the time to explain what thought goes into it. Nobody says you can't use that document again. Now, if it's student work, it's not current. But so some of it you've already done some serious thinking and some creation that should be easier for promotion. Student evaluations, peer observations, and student learning outcomes are the ones that I go to first. And I think they're worth spending some time on. Because if you can show me, I want my students to do the following, and here's how I chart that, then I can open up syllabi and look at materials and see evidence of that as opposed to the other way around. So those are the 3 that I think people are drawn to. Now, the student learning outcomes is something I think we're trying to get people to think about more, and they're not always full. you don't need 200 examples of student work. It's much more effective to have 2 or 3, and to the extent that it's in your narrative and you say, I care about the following. So one of the things in my own narrative, I cared that they could take any written for specialist audience research article off the shelf and make sense of it. They don't have to understand it perfectly. They don't have to be able to conduct independent research. They need to find the research questions and the analysis and tell me who the participants were. And so we spent a lot of time pulling these things out. So I gave a couple examples of how I taught it and a couple examples of students showing that they could do that. And then I added on my OCQ questions that said, I can read a research article in this field now. So I have 3 points of data all pointing at the same objective, but it's not a ton of material. It's just that it all connected and I could put it in the narrative. So I think less is more, particularly when it all tells the same story.
I think that adding OCQ
Yeah,
questions is really important. I know for me, I found that helpful because otherwise the existing questions are great, but they just feel very subjective. And I had classes where I added items about them feeling comfortable and discussing controversial topics about sexuality. But I had one class that was very discussion oriented, and then I had items about that because I was worried that it might be perceived as we were just sitting around talking all the time, but there were real reasons why we did that for a class on sexual harassment. And so it was very helpful for me at the end to be able to show why we did what we did.
Absolutely. And I think just the 2 examples we gave illustrate how diverse our goals are for the classroom. And so to the extent that you know what your goals are and articulate them, readership from really broad backgrounds can make sense of it and appreciate it in all the right ways.
Yeah, I think of the things you want to attach as being like figures per paper, right? You're making the following argument, let's have some data that show it. If people want to read more, see Appendix B, and you can link within your dossier if they want to. So the better you direct people, the less likely it is they just look at something random. Because no one's going to read it all if you put too much.
I also think it's incredibly important to just do what you can to get students to take the evaluations.
Oh, yeah.
Because we all know, right, that like your numbers are much more stable if you have more people reporting, and if you've only got 3 people or 5 people responding, you're going to be really subject to. I don't have to tell you the statistician a lot of error.
Actually, I have 2 thresholds for my class. They get to 80% as a class. They get like a 0.5 to their final average, and if they get to 90, they get another. So it's sort of peer pressure. And that whole time it's going on, I'm like, I don't see your responses, but we're at 67%, And
Yeah, I can't tell who.
I can't tell who.
I also announce it regularly, and I actually take 15 minutes at the beginning, not the end, but the beginning of a class session. And I say, get your phones out, and then I walk out of the room. And even so, somebody was bold enough to sit there and waste my 15 minutes and not fill it out. But I had a 92% response rate. So, you can't control the one who was cramming for the test. It was the class immediately afterwards. But it sure did change the overall percentage. And who knows,
Although I had
maybe
to
it was
give a
for the best,
lecture about not
maybe.
harassing your fellow students on campus either, because that happened.
Yeah, you do have to have some guidelines.
Oh, they were like, someone was like, take this, I need the extra whatever point, and someone else was like, don't harass me, or I'm just not going to take it, and then someone's like, you're a jerk. I got all this secondhand, of course. So then I have to set the guidelines, like, this is not a form of cyberbullying, thank you. We are criminal justice, but please, let's not do that.
That's funny.
I know, it was funny, but I didn't know until somebody told me, they're like, oh yeah, people were getting pretty mad, and I was like, oh, well, somebody should have brought that to me sooner. But yeah.
Alice.
The syllabus.
Yeah.
I'm at that point where that's become a different beast, right? So like the piece of paper that I would have formally saved as a PDF and put on my dossier is now, pretty much I'm not planning on having that anymore, right? I just
Because
have
you do it in Canvas.
yeah, I
that's
just
all
have a
they
Canvas website and
Yeah, that's a great question.
what are we doing now?
I don't know, I'm
Uploading.
still dragging my feet on that because it
Okay.
annoys me that I have to make it all link up, and if it doesn't correct right, then it puts it right in the grade and the wrong distribution, so I have not taken the plunge. But I
And
don't
you've not seen
know
that as being part
how
of
you
these dossiers yet?
pull it
I thought you could print a syllabus from Canvas.
But it wouldn't
That's right,
really
nothing's
give you a sense
organized.
of.
No, it's not a really awesome one, but I thought there was a way to pull it together.
It's
But
just
I,
if you
where
could
you put
pull
things in
it.
which sections, but I just, copied and pasted, but I made clear that I said at the top, like, this was originally organized in Canvas, so that way if somebody was looking at it with a critical eye about format,
Yeah.
that it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be an issue for them.
Yeah.
I think more people understand that now too, though, is that they're
Screenshot a
formatted
couple
differently.
things or
I've done screenshots.
have links.
Yeah, I've done
Mhm.
screenshots for assignments, prompts, things like that.
Mhm.
But the syllabus, this would be the first semester that I'm just not planning on having.
is
the
that
syllabus.
accessible?
At all?
Is that allowed during under
Yeah, no, there's no
accessibility?
need, right? Because it's all in Canvas, right? Everything is described and everything is there.
And the rules and the regulations and the religious holidays and,
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah.
yeah.
Am I the only one doing this? Because I am not a techie, okay?
Yeah,
no, I
You're
know,
just saying
yeah,
you don't
I
have
would
a
do
separate
everything like
document.
module.
I don't have like a
So-
piece of, yeah.
But you have all the information there.
I still organize everything in a syllabus first and then I load it into Canvas, I don't get it.
Well, but if you're doing all your assignments in Canvas and then the grading is happening, it just, you
Yeah.
build it in there.
Yeah, but that's over time, whereas organization from the
I
beginning.
thought you had to have a syllabus because of accessibility though.
Well, but you do, I mean, the thing is, if Allison hits print, it'll print a syllabus, I think.
Yeah, there's a click on a thing,
Yeah.
it's called syllabus.
Yeah.
Oh. So just maybe make that look as good as possible for eDossier.
And then the screenshot though is a good idea.
And then just indicate that it was,
And I wouldn't worry too much about the
All right.
format. Well, we didn't talk about this, but PDFs, please, as you're saving things, it's
Yes.
great, well, I mean, you don't have to save it that way, but when you upload it into eDossier, a PDF makes it so much easier because of the password control, and every time you open Word, it downloads it onto someone's hard drive, and there are issues of confidentiality and security. So as you're thinking about creating these things, if you can have a PDF archive as opposed to a Word on Mac or Word on PC or archive, it
You
makes a
lose
big
things.
difference for the
They
reader.
say they go back and forth, but they don't.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
They
I've learned
just
that the hard
don't.
way.
No, you're
I've
absolutely
learned that
right.
the hard way, staff discussion.
So, next workshop on documenting research.
Oh boy.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you.
And I think Suzanne will make this available on